At a bustling airport, a routine flight check-in takes a shocking turn when Karen, a suspicious traveler, accuses a well-dressed black businessman, David Johnson, of carrying a fake passport. Convinced that she's uncovered a dangerous fraud, she refuses to back down even when security clears him. But the deeper she digs, the stranger things become. Why does David have access to restricted areas? Why is security protecting him? And has Karen truly uncovered a conspiracy, or is she walking straight into a trap? As the walls close in, secrets unravel, and the truth turns against her in ways she never imagined. By the end of this journey, one of them will walk away victorious, while the other loses everything. Stick around to see how this shocking airport confrontation spirals out of control. And before we begin, make sure to subscribe to the channel so you never miss a story packed with twists, suspense, and unexpected justice. David adjusted his tie as he stood in line at the passport control section of the bustling JFK International Airport. It was a routine trip, another business flight, another set of meetings in Geneva. He had done this 100 times before. Yet, something felt different this time. Behind him, a woman with neatly curled blonde hair and an expression of barely contained suspicion studied him with narrowed eyes. "Excuse me," she whispered, tugging at the sleeve of a nearby security officer. "That man, something's not right. I think he might be using a fake passport." The officer, a middle-aged man with a tired expression, sighed. "Ma'am, we have strict procedures." "No," Karen interrupted. "I recognize him. He was on the FBI's most wanted list. You need to check his passport." David, who had been silent, slowly turned his head. His dark brown eyes locked onto Karen's, unreadable yet piercing. "I beg your pardon?" His voice was calm, but there was an undeniable steeliness to it. Karen crossed her arms. "I'm just doing my duty as a good citizen." The security officer sighed again, clearly reluctant but obligated to follow protocol. "Sir, may I see your passport?" David nodded, already sensing where this was going. He pulled out a sleek, dark blue passport and handed it over. The officer scanned it. A green checkmark blinked on the screen. "Everything is in order, ma'am," he said, handing the passport back. But Karen wasn't satisfied. "That can't be right. He could be using a stolen identity." The officer frowned. "Ma'am, do you have any proof?" "Proof?" Karen scoffed. "People like him always find ways to trick the system." The terminal fell silent. A few passengers shifted uncomfortably. Some glanced at Karen with irritation. Others simply looked away, not wanting to get involved. David exhaled sharply. "People like me?" Karen faltered for a moment but quickly recovered. "I didn't mean, I just meant," but before she could finish, another voice joined in. "Ma'am, if you're wrong, this could be considered harassment." A different officer, this one in a more decorated uniform, said as he stepped forward. Karen hesitated, her confidence wavering. But then she lifted her chin defiantly. "I'm never wrong about these things. He needs to be detained." David clenched his jaw, but before he could respond, the second officer spoke again. "Let's check the system." He turned to a nearby counter, where a staff member input David's passport number into a high-security database. Seconds later, the screen flashed. The color drained from Karen's face as the results appeared. David Johnson, VIP clearance. Diplomatic traveler. Special government access. A stunned silence overtook the terminal. Even the officers stiffened at the name. Karen took a step back. No, this has to be a mistake." The first officer straightened up. "Mr. Johnson, we apologize for the inconvenience." Karen's mouth opened and closed like a fish gasping for air. "Wait. No, he has to be faking it. There's no way the government would give someone like him a VIP passport." A murmur ran through the crowd. Some passengers shook their heads. Others whispered to each other. The second officer's expression hardened. "Ma'am, you are dangerously close to committing a criminal offense." David tilted his head, studying Karen. His lips curled slightly, whether in amusement or something darker. It was hard to tell. Tell me, Miss? Karen suspect. Tell me, Karen. David continued, his voice calm measured. Why does my existence offend you so much? Karen faltered, but forced a smirk. It's not personal. It's just, I trust my instincts. David gave a short, humorless chuckle. And what do your instincts tell you now? Karen had no answer. The officer sighed. Sir, please proceed. We'll handle this. David gave Karen one last look before grabbing his passport and stepping forward. But Karen wasn't done. With desperation creeping into her voice, she turned to the officers. You're all making a mistake. You're going to regret this. No one answered her. David disappeared down the terminal. Karen clenched her fists. This wasn't over. Not by a long shot. Karen's heart pounded as she stood frozen in the middle of the terminal, her mind racing for a way to salvage the situation. This couldn't be happening. There was no way she had just made a scene over someone with government clearance. The officers had to be wrong. No, he had to be faking it. As David disappeared into the terminal, Karen's panic turned into rage. Her face burned, not just with embarrassment, but with the creeping realization that she had lost control of the situation. She had been so certain. How could she be wrong? She spun toward the officer who had dismissed her. You need to stop him, she insisted. He could still be a criminal. You can't just let him go. The officer, clearly exhausted by her persistence, exhaled through his nose. Ma'am, we already confirmed his identity. He is authorized to travel. Karen shook her head. That means nothing. You don't understand how these people operate. They steal identities, forge documents, these people. The officer's voice had an edge now. His patience was wearing thin. Karen swallowed, but didn't back down. I didn't mean it like that. I'm just saying you need to double-check. The officer exchanged a glance with his colleague. Then, without another word, he turned away. Karen felt her chest tighten. They weren't listening. They were treating her like she was crazy, like she was just some hysterical woman causing a scene. A sudden clap echoed through the terminal. Karen whipped around, startled. A tall, middle-aged man in a suit stood nearby, slowly clapping his hands together. His expression was unreadable, but there was something unsettling about his smirk. Well, he said, stepping closer. If it isn't Karen. Karen narrowed her eyes. Do I know you? The man tilted his head. Oh, you know me? Not personally, of course. But let's just say you've made quite a reputation for yourself. Karen's skin prickled. There was something about the way he looked at her, like he knew something she didn't. Who the hell are you? She snapped. The man took another step forward. I'm someone who remembers things. Like, say, a certain lawsuit against you a few years ago? Karen stiffened. No. This wasn't possible. The man grinned. Oh, you remember now, don't you? She took a half step back. That was years ago. That has nothing to do with this. The man shrugged. And yet, here you are. Same Karen, different day. A few nearby passengers had stopped to watch. Karen felt the weight of their stares. Shut up, she hissed. You don't know anything about me. The man raised an eyebrow. Don't I? Before she could retort, another voice cut through the tension. Karen Wilson. The hairs on the back of her neck stood up. She turned slowly. A young woman in an airport uniform stood near the security desk, holding up a printed document. Karen's travel record. You've been flagged in our system, the woman said, scanning the paper. It appears you've had multiple complaints filed against you for inappropriate behavior. Karen's stomach dropped. What? She blurted out. The woman nodded. 3 incidents in the last 2 years. 1 in Atlanta. 1 in Miami. And now this. Karen's hands curled into fists. This is harassment. You people are just trying to silence me because I spoke up. The woman didn't react. You're free to board your flight, but airport security has been alerted. If there's any further disturbance, you may be detained. Karen's breath hitched. Detained? She had never been this close to actual consequences before. "This is a mistake," she said, forcing herself to stay calm. "You're treating me like a criminal when I was just trying to keep everyone safe." "Safe from what?" The suited man from earlier folded his arms. "A businessman with a government-issued passport?" Karen couldn't answer that. She refused to answer that. Instead, she grabbed her carry-on and stormed off, ignoring the whispers and glances from those around her. This wasn't over. Not by a long shot. As she stomped toward her gate, her mind raced. She had two options now. One, drop it. Pretend this never happened. Try to move on. Two, find a way to prove she was right. And Karen never admitted defeat. She spotted an airport lounge nearby and veered toward it, her heels clicking furiously against the tile floor. She needed time to think. She needed a plan. David Johnson wasn't just some random businessman. He had connections. He had power. And that meant he had secrets. All she had to do was find them. Karen sat in the airport lounge, gripping her coffee cup so tightly that the lid nearly popped off. She had made a fool of herself again, but this time, the consequences felt heavier. 3 past complaints. Security on high alert. Threats of detention. None of it made sense. She wasn't the bad guy here. She was right. David Johnson had to be hiding something. The way the officers reacted to his name. The way the airport staff scrambled, it all felt staged. Like they were covering for him. Karen pulled out her phone, hands shaking. She needed proof. Her fingers moved swiftly across the screen as she searched David Johnson. Thousands of results popped up: a respected entrepreneur, a philanthropist, a government consultant. She clenched her jaw. No one is that perfect. She scrolled further. There had to be something, anything. A few articles mentioned his involvement in government contracts. Others highlighted his humanitarian work. But then Karen froze. A blurry, grainy mugshot stared back at her. Her breath caught in her throat. I knew it. She tapped the image, and an old news article loaded. The headline read, "David Johnson arrested at 19 for trespassing, charges dropped due to lack of evidence." Karen's lips curled into a triumphant smirk. There it is. He wasn't as clean as he pretended to be. She leaned back in her seat, exhaling. Now, she just needed to make sure the airport security saw this. Before she could move, a shadow loomed over her table. "Enjoying your research?" Karen flinched. David Johnson stood before her, calm, composed, watching her. Her phone slipped from her fingers, landing on the table with a soft thud. Karen quickly straightened up, trying to mask her shock. "Excuse me?" David took a seat across from her, uninvited, his dark eyes locked onto hers. "You're persistent," he said, his tone unreadable. "I'll give you that." Karen narrowed her eyes. "I don't know what you're talking about." David chuckled, shaking his head. "Let's not insult each other's intelligence. You're digging into my past, trying to find something, anything, to justify your accusations." Karen felt a bead of sweat form at the nape of her neck. How did he know? She quickly composed herself. "I have every right to look up public information." David leaned forward slightly. "Of course. And I have every right to call my lawyer if you continue harassing me." Karen scoffed. "Harassing? I'm protecting innocent travelers from potential fraud." David's expression darkened just slightly. "Innocent travelers like me?" Karen didn't answer. Instead, she turned her phone screen toward him. "Explain this." David glanced down at the mugshot, then back at her. No reaction. No surprise. "That was 25 years ago," he said flatly. Karen folded her arms. "A criminal record is a criminal record." David smirked. "It was expunged. You know what that means, right?" Karen hated how calm he was. People don't just get arrested for no reason. David exhaled, rubbing his temple. "Let me guess. You think that because of a single arrest at 19 I must be some criminal mastermind faking my way through life?" Karen opened her mouth then shut it. "Tell me, Karen," David continued, voice dropping lower. If a white kid had been arrested for the same thing, would you still be this obsessed? Karen stiffened. That's not what this is about. David tilted his head. Isn't it? Karen felt the weight of his gaze, and for the first time, a sliver of doubt crept into her mind. Before she could respond, a voice interrupted. Is everything all right here? Karen turned. A security officer stood a few feet away, watching them carefully. David sat back, offering a polite smile. We're fine, just having a discussion. The officer hesitated, then nodded before walking away. David glanced back at Karen. See? People are watching you now. They know who you are. Karen swallowed. I'd be careful, he added, rising from his seat. You're running out of places to hide. And with that he walked away, disappearing into the crowd. Karen sat frozen, pulse hammering in her ears. For the first time, she wasn't sure if she was the hunter or the prey. Karen sat rigid in her chair, her fingers gripping the armrests so tightly that her knuckles turned white. Her encounter with David Johnson had left her rattled in a way she hadn't expected. He wasn't just some random businessman brushing off her accusations. He was watching her now. He knew she was digging, and he wasn't afraid. That unsettled her the most. She wasn't used to people standing up to her like that. Usually, they crumbled under pressure, desperate to avoid conflict. But David? He had looked right through her. Karen's gaze flickered to the security officer who had briefly interrupted them. The way he had looked at her suspiciously made her stomach twist. They were all turning against her. She needed to act fast. Pulling out her phone again, she scrolled back to David's mugshot. She wasn't stupid. She knew one arrest from 25 years ago wasn't enough to ruin him, but it proved one thing. He wasn't spotless. And if there was one skeleton in his closet, there had to be more. Karen's fingers moved quickly across the screen. She bypassed the glowing articles about his humanitarian work, his business ventures, and government contracts. Those were just distractions. Then something caught her eye. A lawsuit. Her heart skipped. She clicked the link. Johnson versus State of Louisiana plaintiff. David Johnson filed. 2005 status. Settled out of court. Karen frowned, skimming through the details. The lawsuit was against a police department for wrongful arrest. David had sued for racial profiling and won. Her stomach twisted with frustration. Of course. He had played the victim card and walked away with a settlement. Karen's jaw clenched. He wasn't just protected by the government. He was the kind of man who knew how to manipulate the system. And now, the same system was protecting him again. She needed more. Her mind was racing with ideas when a voice snapped her out of her thoughts. Excuse me, ma'am? Karen flinched. She turned to see a man in an airport uniform standing beside her table. His name tag read Eric Malone. Can I help you? She asked cautiously. Eric hesitated, then lowered his voice. I saw what happened earlier. You were questioning that guy, right? Johnson? Karen's pulse quickened. Yes, she said carefully. Why? Eric glanced around before pulling out his phone and sliding it across the table. Karen's brows furrowed as she looked. Down. On the screen was a security camera screenshot David Johnson walking through a restricted access area of the airport. Karen's breath caught. Where did you get this? Eric scratched the back of his neck. I work in security operations. I overheard you earlier. Figured you might want to see this. Karen's mind spun. Restricted access? What was David doing back there? She looked up at Eric, her pulse pounding. Does anyone else know about this? Eric shook his head. Not yet. I mean, he's got clearance so no one questions him, but I don't trust it. Thought someone should take a second look. Karen gripped the phone tighter. This was it. Her instincts had been right all along. David wasn't just some businessman. He was doing something he wasn't supposed to be doing. She stood abruptly, her chair scraping against the tile. I need you to show me where this was taken. Eric hesitated. I could get in trouble. Karen stepped closer, lowering her voice. Listen to me. I know people like him. They use their power to hide things. You're the only one who can help stop whatever he's doing. Eric swallowed, glancing around nervously. Finally, he nodded. Okay, follow me. Karen smirked. Now, the real hunt began. Karen followed Eric through the terminal, weaving between travelers who were blissfully unaware of the unfolding conspiracy. Her pulse quickened. She was onto something. David Johnson wasn't just some businessman with a clean record. He had access to restricted areas, and now she had proof. Where was this taken? She asked as they moved past a row of duty-free shops. Eric glanced around before lowering his voice. Security footage from an access point near Terminal D. Only authorized personnel are allowed back there. Karen's lips pressed into a thin line. And you're sure he had no reason to be there? Eric hesitated. Look, officially, his clearance checks out. But he looked her in the eye. I've been doing this job long enough to know when something doesn't sit right. Karen felt a surge of satisfaction. Finally, someone who wasn't blind to the truth. As they approached a side hallway marked airport staff only, Eric hesitated, looking over his shoulder before swiping his keycard. The metal doors slid open, revealing a dimly lit corridor lined with security cameras. This is it, he whispered. Karen stepped inside, the air cooler and quieter than the chaos of the terminal. Her heels clicked against the polished floor. The space was narrow, lined with unmarked doors. Where exactly did he go? She asked. Eric pointed to a screen on the wall, a live security feed. He tapped a few buttons, rewinding to the footage he had shown her earlier. There it was again, David Johnson, walking past an access gate, disappearing through a door labeled restricted. Level 4 clearance only. Karen's stomach twisted. Level 4? She repeated. Eric nodded. Only government officials and select personnel have access. Karen's breath caught. What the hell is he doing back there? Eric didn't answer. He was already typing into his security terminal, trying to pull more footage. Then the screen glitched. What the Eric muttered, rapidly pressing buttons. The footage cut out. Karen felt her blood turn cold. Did you just lose access? She asked. Eric's face had gone pale. I know this shouldn't be happening. Someone just locked me out. Karen's pulse pounded. Someone knew they were watching. Can you get back? She urged. Eric swallowed. I can try, but if security catches me messing with the system, I'll be fired. Karen clenched her jaw. You want the truth, don't you? Eric hesitated. Then, with a determined nod, he started bypassing the security lock. Karen turned her attention back to the hallway. David had gone through that door. And whatever was back there, someone didn't want her to see it. She took a step forward. Wait, Eric whispered. You can't go back there. You don't have clearance. Karen smirked. Since when has that stopped me? Before Eric could stop her, she pushed open the door. The click of the door closing behind her sent a chill down Karen's spine. She had expected to step into a sterile office space or some kind of high-security checkpoint, but instead she was in a hallway even darker than the last. Dim overhead lights flickered as she moved cautiously forward, her heels muffled by the carpeted floor. A faint humming noise filled the air, the distant sound of machinery working behind unseen walls. Her heart pounded. What the hell was this place? Karen turned back to the door, reaching for the handle, but it didn't budge. Her stomach dropped. She was locked in. She swallowed hard, forcing herself to stay calm. There had to be another exit. There always was. A few feet ahead, the hallway split into two directions. One path led to a security checkpoint with another sealed door, while the other curved into a dimly lit room marked Authorized Personnel Only. Karen chose the latter, pushing open the door just enough to slip inside. She found herself in what looked like a control room. A long metal table stretched across the space, cluttered with computer monitors, folders, and security badges. A row of TV screens mounted. On the wall displayed different areas of the airport, some of which she didn't even recognize. Karen's breath caught. This wasn't just any restricted area. This was a private surveillance hub. She inched forward, scanning the screens. One showed luggage handling tunnels, another the airport tarmac, but the one that made her freeze was a live feed of the VIP terminal. And there, on the screen, was David Johnson. Karen's fingers curled into fists. He was standing in front of a secure loading dock, talking to someone wearing a badge that looked suspiciously like government credentials. She knew it. David Johnson wasn't just an innocent businessman. He was involved in something bigger. Karen quickly scanned the desk for any clues. A clipboard caught her attention. She grabbed it, flipping through pages of passenger names, security codes, and flight details. Then she saw it. David Johnson. Flight 47A. Special access. Government clearance. Cargo hold access granted. Her mind raced. Cargo hold? Why would a businessman have clearance to a cargo hold? Before she could process it, a low beep filled the room. Karen turned. The monitors were flashing. Someone had triggered an alert. Then footsteps. Heavy, deliberate. Getting closer. Karen's breath hitched. She had to hide. She darted behind a metal storage cabinet, crouching low just as the door swung open. Through the small gap, she saw a man in a security uniform step inside. He wasn't just some low-level officer. His posture was too rigid, too controlled. He was someone higher up. The man scanned the room, his eyes narrowing at the clipboard Karen had just touched. He picked it up, flipping through the pages. Then his gaze lifted. Karen held her breath. Had he seen her? The man exhaled sharply and tapped his earpiece. Surveillance breach. We have an unauthorized entry. Karen's stomach turned to ice. Then a second voice crackled through the radio. Understood. Lock down Terminal D. No one leaves until we find them. Karen clenched her fists. She had just made a very, very big mistake. Karen's lungs burned as she forced herself to stay still, pressed tightly against the cold metal cabinet. The security officer stood mere feet away, clipboard in hand, eyes scanning the room like a predator sniffing out prey. Surveillance breach. We have an unauthorized entry. The words echoed in her mind. She had been careful, hadn't she? But now it didn't matter. She was caught. Or at least she would be if she didn't act fast. Through the narrow gap between the cabinet and the wall, she saw the officer's fingers tighten around his radio. Repeat. Suspect is inside the restricted area. Initiate full lockdown. Karen swallowed hard. If the airport locked down, she was finished. Her pulse pounded as she glanced around, searching for an escape route. The room was small with only one exit, the door the officer had just come through. No windows. No vents big enough to squeeze through. A dead end. Unless her eyes flicked toward the row of TV monitors, still displaying live feeds of various locations in the airport. One screen showed the hallway outside this very room and another security officer approaching fast. Karen cursed under her breath. Two of them. She had seconds to decide. If she stayed hidden, they would find her. If she ran, they would chase her. Neither option was good, but only one gave her a chance. Run. Karen inhaled sharply, bracing herself. The officer turned slightly, distracted by his radio. That was all she needed. With a sudden burst of movement, Karen lunged out from behind the cabinet. The officer barely had time to react. Hey! Karen grabbed the clipboard from his hands and shoved him backward. Caught off guard, he stumbled, knocking over a chair. Karen bolted. Her heels pounded against the floor as she sprinted through the open doorway, heart hammering in her chest. Another officer was coming straight at her. Karen didn't hesitate. She veered left, straight into the main hallway. Alarms blared. Overhead, a robotic voice echoed through the speakers. Security breach detected. Restricted area on lockdown. Doors slammed shut behind her, sealing off parts of the corridor. She didn't slow down. She had to get out. Karen burst into another side hallway, nearly crashing into a luggage cart. A worker yelped as she shoved past him, knocking over a stack of neatly packed suitcases. "Stop her!" someone yelled behind her. She ran faster. Ahead, a door marked exit gleamed under the flickering fluorescent lights. Almost there, then a figure stepped in front of her. Karen skidded to a halt, her breath coming in ragged gasps. Her stomach dropped. It was David Johnson. He stood calm and composed, arms crossed, watching her like he had been expecting this moment. Karen's mind raced. How was he here? Had he known she'd come looking? Behind her, the footsteps of security officers closed in. Trapped. For the first time, panic surged through Karen's chest. David sighed. "You really don't know when to quit, do you?" Karen gritted her teeth. "I knew it. You're hiding something." David tilted his head. "Funny. I was going to say the same thing about you." Karen's nails dug into her palms. "You've got access to the cargo hold. VIP clearance. Government protection. What exactly are you transporting, David?" His lips curled slightly. "Now that's an interesting question." Karen's pulse thundered. Behind her, security was just seconds away. She had one chance left. Karen lunged forward. She wasn't going down without a fight. Karen lunged at David, aiming to shove past him, but he barely moved. It was like hitting a brick wall. His reflexes were sharp, too sharp, as he smoothly stepped aside, letting her momentum carry her forward. She stumbled, barely catching herself before crashing into the exit door. Before she could reach for the handle, David's voice cut through the chaos behind her. "Open that door, and you'll regret it." Karen froze. His tone wasn't a threat, it was a warning. "Come." Certain. Behind her, the heavy footsteps of security officers grew louder. She had no time. Ignoring him, Karen grasped the handle and yanked. The door didn't budge. A security lock. Panic twisted in her stomach. David sighed behind her. "You think you're the hunter in this scenario, Karen. But you're not." Karen whirled around, her breath ragged. "Oh, and I suppose you are?" David took a slow step forward. "No, I'm just the one who knows what's going on." Karen clenched her fists. "I don't believe you." David shook his head. "You've been so busy trying to expose me that you never stopped to ask the right question." Karen glared at him. "And what's that?" David held her gaze. "Who set you up?" Karen's breath hitched. "What?" David gestured toward the hallway where she had come from. "You think you found me? You think you caught me sneaking into a restricted area?" He tilted his head. "But someone led you there, didn't they?" Karen hesitated. "Eric." He had given her the security footage. He had led her straight to this door. Her gut twisted. David studied her reaction and smirked. "I see you starting to get it." Before Karen could respond, the security team arrived. "Hands where we can see them." Two officers stormed forward, one of them grabbing Karen's arm before she could protest. "Wait," she started, but they were already restraining her. "You are under arrest for trespassing in a restricted area," Karen struggled. "No, he's the one you should be looking at." She jerked her head toward David, but he simply stood there, watching. The first officer exchanged a look with David, then nodded. "We'll take it from here, sir." Karen's blood ran cold. "Excuse me?" The officer barely glanced at her. "You're the one in violation of federal security policies, ma'am. Mr. Johnson is a cleared government contractor." Karen's mind reeled. David had played her. He had been one step ahead the whole time. As the officers tightened their grip, David finally spoke again. "Karen," he said smoothly, "you walked right into this." Karen's jaw tightened. "You think this is over?" David's smile didn't reach his eyes. "No, I think you're just realizing it's only beginning." Then, without another word, he turned and walked away. And Karen, for the first time in her life, had no way out. Karen's pulse pounded as the security officers dragged her down the corridor, their grips iron tight on her arms. Her heels scraped against the polished floor as she twisted against them. But it was useless. She was trapped. "Let me go," she hissed, trying to yank her arms free. "You don't understand. That man, he's hiding something." Neither officer responded. The humiliation burned hotter than her fear. Karen had never been treated like this before. People like her, good citizens, vigilant travelers, responsible Americans, weren't the ones getting escorted away in handcuffs. And yet, here she was. David had done this. He had turned the game against her. Her mind reeled, searching for a way out. She just needed to make them listen, to get anyone to realize the truth. Karen took a sharp breath and forced her voice into something steadier. "Look, just check the security footage. You'll see I was set up. That employee Eric Malone, he gave me the footage of Johnson in the restricted area." The officer on her right barely reacted. "We already spoke with Mr. Malone, ma'am." Karen stiffened. The second officer scoffed. "He claims he never gave you anything. Said you pressured him to give you unauthorized access." Her stomach dropped. No, that wasn't possible. Eric had helped her. He had given her proof. Hadn't he? Doubt slithered through her mind. Had he led her here on purpose? Had she really been played so easily? A shiver ran down Karen's spine. Nothing made sense anymore. "Listen to me," she tried again, her voice sharper now. "Check the logs. David Johnson accessed a level 4 restricted area. There's no reason a businessman should have that kind of clearance." Something is the officer cut her off. Mr. Johnson's clearance was authorized by federal agencies. His tone was final, uninterested. There is nothing suspicious about his movements. Karen's breath caught. They had already checked. Her head spun as they pushed through a security checkpoint, leading her into a small, sterile interrogation room. A single metal chair sat bolted to the floor across from a steel table. "Sit," the officer ordered. Karen's legs locked, refusing to move. "I didn't do anything wrong." The officer sighed. "Ma'am, you trespassed into a restricted government area, resisted airport security, and caused a disturbance. You are very close to federal charges." Karen gaped at him. Charges? She was the one. Being treated like a criminal? The rage boiled up again, white-hot and consuming. "You don't get it. He set me up. He's the one using this airport for something illegal." The officer's gaze didn't waver. "And yet the only person in custody is you." Karen's throat tightened. She wanted to scream, wanted to demand a lawyer, but the creeping realization hit her all at once. No one would believe her. Not because she lacked evidence. She had seen David in the restricted area with her own eyes, but because no one wanted to believe her. David wasn't just some businessman. He had connections, power, and she was just another hysterical white woman who had cried wolf one too many times. Karen sank into the metal chair, her mind spinning. For the first time, a terrifying thought crept in. Had she just ruined her own life? Karen sat motionless in the metal chair, the cold steel pressing against her spine. Her world had shrunk to this tiny, sterile interrogation room. No windows, no clock, just the distant hum of the airport beyond the walls. Her thoughts raced, desperate for a way out. Think, Gadden, think. She wasn't supposed to be the one in trouble. She was the one exposing the truth. Yet here she was, locked in a room like a criminal while David Johnson walked free. The door swung open with a metallic clank. A woman entered, dressed in a crisp navy blue suit. Her ID badge read Special Agent Rebecca Hayes, Department of Homeland Security. Karen's breath hitched. Finally, someone who would listen. Agent Hayes sat across from her, folding her hands neatly on the table. "Ms. Wilson." Karen straightened. "Thank God. Finally, someone who can save it," Hayes interrupted, her voice cool. "You've caused quite a scene today." Karen's jaw clenched. "I was trying to stop a criminal." Hayes didn't blink. "You mean David Johnson?" Karen leaned forward. "Yes. He was in a restricted area." "I have proof, do you?" Hayes asked, arching an eyebrow. Karen faltered. Hayes pulled a file folder from her briefcase and laid it on the table. Slowly, she flipped it open. Karen's own face stared back at her. Her airport records, security reports, past complaints filed against her. Karen's stomach dropped. Hayes tapped the folder. I took the liberty of reviewing your travel history. 3 previous incidents: Atlanta, Miami, Denver. Every time, you accused a black man of something suspicious. Karen's throat went dry. That's not the same, she stammered. Hayes's gaze remained unreadable. Isn't it? Karen felt a heat rise to her cheeks. I was just being cautious. Hayes exhaled. Karen, do you know what the term vexatious litigant means? Karen blinked. What? Hayes leaned forward. It's a legal term for someone who repeatedly makes false accusations or frivolous claims. Judges can ban these people from filing complaints altogether. Karen's chest tightened. I'm not lying. Hayes's expression didn't change. Maybe you believe that, but you don't have a single shred of credible evidence against Mr. Johnson. Karen's fingers curled into fists. Then explain why he was in a restricted area. Hayes flipped to another document. Mr. Johnson is a federal consultant with clearance to handle classified government cargo. Karen's head snapped up. What? Yes. Hayes continued. He's been vetted by DHS, TSA, and State Department security. Whatever he was doing in that area, it was legal. Karen shook her head. No, that can't be right. Hayes studied her. Because it doesn't fit the story in your head? Karen opened her mouth, but no words came out. The weight of reality pressed against her like a vice. She had nothing. No evidence. No credibility. And now, not even a way to justify what she'd done. A knock at the door interrupted them. Another officer leaned in, whispering something to Hayes. Karen tried to listen, but all she caught was, she's been officially banned from domestic air travel. Her heart stopped. Hayes turned back to her. Ms. Wilson, effective immediately, you're placed on the TSA no-fly list. Karen's entire body went cold. You're free to go, Hayes said, standing. But you won't be flying out today, or any day soon. Karen's breath caught. You can't do this. Hayes's expression was unreadable. You did it to yourself. With that, she gathered her files and walked out, leaving Karen alone in silence. And for the first time in her life, Karen had nowhere left to run. Karen thought she had it all figured out until the truth turned against her. Now, she's banned from flying, exposed for her lies, and left with nothing but regret. What do you think? Did Karen deserve what happened, or was she just a victim of her own paranoia? Let us know your thoughts in the comments. And before you go, where in the world are you watching from? Drop your country or city in the comments. If you enjoyed this story, don't forget to like, share, and subscribe for more thrilling tales with unexpected twists. Turn on notifications so you never miss an upload.